So stress is a fascinating thing to study because, like death, it's inevitable, and everyone faces it in their day-to-day life. And I study how stress affects the brain. Now, most of the stress that we face as regular people on a regular day-to-day basis is things like economic downturns, relationships ending, issues like this, which are manageable, but they wear us down. So what I'm going to talk about today is traumatic stress, and this is a different beast. And traumatic stress, this is going to encompass things that are much more severe. There's kind of a gradient of how we look at stressful events in our life. Things that are on the traumatic side, this is going to be something like a physical assault, a sexual assault, a car accident, a natural disaster like an earthquake, being in the middle of a war for a lot of veterans who've been over there. And traumatic stress seems to have a different effect in terms of it really can leave a residual impact on someone. Statistics seem to predict that roughly 7 out of 10 people, or about 70% of the general population in North America, will be exposed to some form of a traumatic stressor in their lifetime. So that's very interesting because that's a pretty big subset of the population. But what's interesting is of this 7 out of 10 or 70%, only about 10% of these people will then go on to actually develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And what that equates to is that within the general population then, what we're looking at is roughly 8% of the people in North America at some point in their life will experience post-traumatic stress disorder. So there are a few questions that are very key and that the psychiatric research world is really interested in answering with respect to PTSD. And one of these is, what's different in the brain of someone who has PTSD versus someone that isn't? And also another important question is, why do some people develop PTSD and others don't? So I'd say we're halfway there. I think we've got a pretty good idea about what's going on in the brain. What we do not know is which people are vulnerable and which aren't. And there's a lot of effort being directed into this to try and see, is there some kind of biological signal that we can extract from someone's DNA or from their blood or some other measurement that will predict if they get sent to war and they experience traumatic stress, when they come home, they have a good chance of getting PTSD. So that's one of the things that we're looking at trying to figure out. But what we're really talking about today is what happens in the brain when someone has PTSD. And so I'm going to give you a crash course in neuroanatomy, which I think is very relevant, and hopefully you'll get some tidbits you can take on your own with this. So I'm going to talk about a part of the brain called the amygdala. And you can see it up there. It's actually the Latin word for almond because it is actually shaped like an almond. The amygdala is an absolutely fascinating part of the brain. So this is what assesses our environment. As all our sensory information gets funneled in through our sensory cortexes and gets processed, it gets dumped into the amygdala, where essentially valence is assigned. And the amygdala then says, is this something that's good? Is it safe? Or is it bad? And is it scary? And this decision is largely done through crosstalk between another part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And in humans and all mammals, this sits at the front of the brain, but for us, this is really well developed. And this is the part of the brain that allows us to engage in very complex forms of cognitive processes and thinking, like, let me evaluate decisions before I say something. So this is the kind of brain that gets turned off when we drink a lot of alcohol, for example. People don't quite think their way through things. So what's interesting in the context of stress and PTSD is, so we have the amygdala, and this is the part of the brain that's constantly bombarded with stimuli, and it's trying to say good, bad, safe, dangerous. Now, a lot of these decisions are made by the amygdala talking to the prefrontal cortex. And it says, have we seen this before? Is it safe or not? And essentially what will happen is, if a stimuli is determined to be potentially threatening, the amygdala essentially will activate a cascade of brain circuits that results in us feeling anxious, causes the release of hormones like adrenaline, and will push us into a stress state. What the prefrontal cortex does is it tempers the amygdala. So I think the best analogy for this is, picture a guy riding a carriage and he's got reins on the horse. And in this situation, you can say the amygdala is the horses and the prefrontal cortex is the guy with the reins. And what his job to do is to keep the reins tight and make sure that the horses don't run wild. And essentially what happens if the prefrontal cortex isn't online or isn't communicating with the amygdala is that the horses run wild. And in the case of the amygdala, what this means is that it loses the ability to start referencing information appropriately and saying, is it safe or not? So what happens in that situation is it seems to flip into this default mode, which is, okay, I'm going to assume everything is potentially dangerous, and I'm going to flip into this state of vigilance where our constant surveying of the environment is looking for threats and danger. And so at a low-grade version of this, you'll get like what we would call a worrywart, like someone who always seems to find danger in the world. At the really extreme ends of this, we have something like PTSD. And what we've learned through neuroimaging studies in PTSD is that there is a very notable disconnection between these brain regions. And so what you can see here is the VMPFC, is the ventromedial PFC. This is a really important part of humans. And the amygdala is in the lower panel. And what you can see is this is just basically a color map. Things that are blue mean that these parts of the brain are less active in individuals with PTSD than they are in healthy controls. And things that are yellow are more active in individuals with PTSD than they are in healthy controls. So what this is telling us, and what a collection of studies from a large amount of researchers around the world have told us, is that essentially what happens in PTSD is we have hyperactivity of the amygdala coupled to hypoactivity of the prefrontal cortex. So essentially, going back to the horse analogy, the guy in the carriage has just given up essentially and let go, and the horses are running wild. And so what you get is the development of these states of anxiety and arousal and stress that an individual with PTSD experiences. So, and as I had said earlier, what we don't understand is why some people develop PTSD and others don't. This seems to be the kind of, let's call it a signature of the brain pattern activities that define PTSD, but we don't know why it is that some people experience this. So this leads into the question and the topic I'm going to go about today, which is, okay, so what about cannabis? So there's a fair amount of media attention in this regard. There have been a lot of things that have come out over the last few years, most notably the RCMP officer who was smoking marijuana in his outfit, his full RCMP garb, and then got caught and was explaining he was using it to regulate his PTSD. There's a lot of blowback because people say, well, there's not enough evidence to look at this. So this has kind of led to the question that has really piqued a lot of people's interest, which is, can pot help? Certainly with PTSD, and in this case, Newsweek asked this question with the context of veterans. So what I'm going to do is explain to you, what do we actually know about this, and is there any scientific basis to support these claims? And so what was really interesting is, through advances in neuroimaging coupled to psychopharmacology, we can start looking at what the effects of drugs are on brain imaging patterns. And so a group in Chicago did a series of very interesting studies, but what they did is they put people in a brain scanner, and they had them look at images that we know light up the amygdala. Since this is the part of our brain that searches for threat, it's a threat detector, in our environments, it lights up very reliably with things like a picture of a weapon, a scared face, blood, and a car accident. Things like this will reliably turn the amygdala on. And so what they did in this study is they gave people in advance THC. So THC, for those of you that don't know, is the psychoactive constituent of cannabis. So this was an isolated preparation from cannabis to say, well, what does THC do to the amygdala when someone gets stressed out? And what they found was that they actually got a very robust blunting of the amygdala in response to stress cues. So you show people these things that normally light up the amygdala and help generate a state of anxiety, and in the presence of THC, this just didn't really seem to happen. So what we've learned from animal research to add on top of this is that cannabinoids like THC actually seem to have the ability to reduce the firing activity of neurons in the amygdala. And the way that they seem to do this is they seem to be able to inhibit the release of excitatory neurochemicals in the amygdala. So there are two kinds of neurochemicals that we have essentially. Excitable ones that when they get released, they make neurons fire and brain areas light up, or inhibitory. And when they get released, they silence neurons and they quiet brain areas down. So in the amygdala, release of excitatory neurochemicals is known to activate this part of the brain in response to stress, and this helps generate that state of anxiety. So what we've learned from the animal side of things, building off of what we've learned from humans, is that yes, it looks like in humans you can decrease activity in the amygdala, and from animal work we've learned you can actually quiet down the activity of those neurons. So there does seem to be some interesting evidence there. But what about the other side of the coin, which is the prefrontal cortex? And this is what I find fascinating about the effects of cannabinoids, is they're very brain region specific. They don't just do the same thing everywhere in the brain. So another group did this really interesting study where they were training people to learn to associate two things together that are aversive. So in this situation, they would play an auditory tone, and then they give people a mild electrical shock. So you do these enough, and then when you play the tone, people actually start sweating. So you get like a skin conductance response because they're expecting that they're going to start getting a shock delivered to them. And so then what they do is they just start playing the tone a whole bunch without getting the shock. And so what we are able to do as organisms that have the ability for these complex cognitive processes is we can unlearn that in a way. We can extinguish that memory. And doing this seems to really involve the prefrontal cortex. So during these tasks, the prefrontal cortex comes online, and it's essentially telling the amygdala, no, don't worry about it anymore. Now this isn't predictive of danger. So in this study, they did that task, but it's similar to the last one. They either gave them THC in advance or didn't. And they saw what happened. And what was interesting was, first off, giving people THC really facilitated the ability to now learn that that was no longer a danger signal. So it promoted kind of what we would refer to as fear extinction or safety learning. At the same time, when they looked at the neuroimaging patterns, like the previous study, they did see reduced activity in the amygdala, but interestingly, they actually found increased activity in the prefrontal cortex. So what this is saying is you're getting very different effects of cannabis in two different brain regions. And again, we can lean on the animal work that we've done to try and understand this. And one of the things that we've learned from animal research is that unlike what happens in the amygdala, in the prefrontal cortex, we can actually see that cannabinoids like THC turn off those inhibitory neurochemicals. So they suppress release of inhibition, and by doing so, they kind of take the brakes away so that the system becomes more active. And so what you're really ending up seeing here is this pattern of neural activity where PTSD is kind of characterized by a hyperactive amygdala that's just gone wild on its own and kind of a deficient prefrontal cortex. And then what we see with cannabis is actually the exact opposite neural signature, where we get blunted amygdala activity and more activity in the prefrontal cortex. So kind of tying this into what does this mean for PTSD, what's very interesting was clinical trials looking at cannabis are decidedly unavailable. There's just not many of them. And it's been something that has fueled the debate between the advocacy crowd and the legal crowd for quite a few decades. So one of the things that has actually been done that does provide us with some information is doctors can prescribe pharmaceutical grade THC. And this is referred to as nabilone. So a study that was actually done in Canada in the Canadian military, a psychiatrist had a bunch of military personnel who had developed PTSD, and they had pretty severe PTSD. They had gone through several different pharmacotherapeutic agents. None of them worked. So they'd gone through several drugs. They were still having really violent nightmares. They were very intrusive, hyper-aroused, anxious, not very functional on a day-to-day basis. And so they gave them nabilone before they went to bed, either nabilone or placebo. And so it was a completely blind trial, which there are few of in this field. And basically what they found was that individuals who got nabilone or synthetic THC before they went to bed, they stopped having nightmares almost immediately. The nightmares curtailed quite a lot. And what they found was this trickle-down effect where the individuals then started having these really big increases in their well-being scores. So when the psychiatrist would ask them on a day-to-day basis, are you doing better? 9 out of the 10 people who went on nabilone said, yes, we're doing better. And 0 of the 10 people who were on placebo said they had any change. And this was a within subjects group, so they actually swapped. So these were the same people who, without being known which drug they were on, had very notable differences. So that's actually the first bit of, I would say, true clinical evidence that there is some signal here that's actually quite interesting. So let's go back to that Newsweek question then, which is, so does pot actually help people with PTSD? And the answer I would have to say at this point is maybe, with science pointing to probably. And that will beg the next question, which is, so does that mean that smoking pot is a good cure for PTSD? Which I would say probably not. This is not something that's like a general approach, I think, that should be taken in medicine. It's telling us something, and there are people who have, through self-medication, learned that it helps their symptoms, and that's good for them. But in terms of using this as a new medication approach, there's going to be a lot of issues surrounding that. And given that there's a lot of change in the legal landscape in Canada that may be coming in the next couple of years, it'll be very interesting to see where this goes. The one thing I'm really hoping for is more actual clinical trials so that we can answer that question definitively, yes or no. Thank you for your attention.
So Matt, questions for Matt? Go ahead. It's hard to see with the lights.
Yeah. Okay, so you're asking then, is the effect of THC on neural activity patterns the same in someone who has PTSD and the same as someone who doesn't? That's what you're asking. Okay, those studies have also not been done. So almost everything that's been done with THC in these neuroimaging studies is all done in healthy controls. There is a recent beginning. The pharmaceutical companies are getting interested in this, and not from a marijuana perspective, but from the brain makes its own version of marijuana. It's like an endorphin. Everyone knows what endorphins are, but there's also these things called endocannabinoids. It's like the brain's version of THC. And so that's the therapeutic target that they're trying to take now, is to say, instead of giving THC, let's see if we can just boost the brain's version of THC, and this is the research we do. So there are studies ongoing now with that, to see if you can boost the brain's version of THC, and if that has a similar effect on neural activity patterns in someone with PTSD and someone that doesn't. And more importantly, they want to see if boosting the brain's natural THC, if that will change the brain of someone who has PTSD to look more like someone who doesn't. So can you get the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala talking again? Can you reinstate that communication in the circuits that seem to have uncoupled?
Okay, yes?
It's possible, it's definitely possible. So, I'll repeat the question, sorry. So the question was with respect to driving a car. So because driving a car requires a certain degree of vigilance, is THC affecting these the same way? So what has actually come out of these simulated driving studies with THC is, it's interesting because it's different than alcohol. What seems to happen with alcohol is people don't realize that they're as impaired as they are, and they drive excessively fast. People under the influence of THC seem to be hyper aware of the fact that they're inebriated, and they end up driving excessively slowly. And so what ends up happening in these driving studies that they've done is the reaction times seem to be a bit slower to, like when they have a simulated child run in front of the car or something. But the actual accident rate is almost exactly the same, because there's this kind of compensation that they develop. That being said, it's been very hard to tease out, and this has been the big question on the legal landscape, is how do you create a cannabis breathalyzer? Because there's going to be some degree of impairment that comes from it, but it's not like alcohol. The metabolism is so different that you really can't accurately tell within 24 hours when someone has consumed, and it makes that very difficult from a legal standpoint. But I mean, the evidence would suggest that yes, there is some degree of impairment, but there's this interesting compensation that you don't see with alcohol.
In the back?
So I haven't run any of these studies. I'm a basic scientist who does primarily animal stuff. I'm really just paying heed to other people's work right now. I've read the studies well, and I've talked to a lot of people that do these things. So what's interesting is in the general public with THC and cannabis, there is a reasonable proportion of people that have very adverse responses, where they develop intense states of panic and paranoia. I have not actually seen that ever reported in any of the studies where they've worked with highly anxious populations, which there was a group of studies that came out a couple of decades ago that looked at social anxiety and generalized anxiety, and now there's the PTSD studies coming out. And in all of these studies, there seems to be actually a reduction in anxiety. And the meaning of that, no one really understands why you're not seeing the same proportion of adverse responses. You do get some adverse responses, so people do tend to say, yes, you know, my short-term memory is a little compromised, I get kind of tired a lot more, I might eat a lot more. I guess those are the kind of standard side effects that you'd see, I guess.
One last question, I think. Go ahead, sir.
So to repeat the question is there actually any studies going forward looking at cannabis in PTSD? So actually, as far as I know, yes, because one of the things that's occurring in the Canadian landscape is with the new medical designation of cannabis, the way that Health Canada has redefined it, what they actually want now is these licensed producers to have clinical data to be able to back up any claims they make. So a lot of these companies are trying to find medical collaborators to which they will help fund studies to look at this. And one of the primary indications is PTSD. As per the comment you had about the benefit seems to be in those that are actively going through other forms of treatment as opposed to people who are just using cannabis. That does not surprise me, because all the studies that have been done where they do this kind of unlearning of fear, essentially, it's when you couple cannabis with that process. It enhances the brain's ability to take that new learning. And all the studies that I'm aware of, because of the ethical setup that you do in medicine, you can't, nowadays at least, deprive people of some form of treatment in the psychiatric sense, from what I'm aware of. And so everyone in these studies all gets some form of CBT. So they're all getting some form of therapy, and on top of it, they're adding placebo or THC to the mix. So this isn't like what you're saying, where people are, I'm assuming, just kind of lying on a couch smoking pot, and they're like, I don't get any better. And I guess that's not hugely surprising, because you do need to couple it with it. And this is an argument in biological psychiatry that we've made quite a bit, is with a lot of the medications that we get, is just handing it to someone doing anything, or do you need, is really what these drugs are doing is opening the windows of plasticity in the brain that will take the new learning better. And I agree, I think that's more what it is.
All right, thank you, Matt. Thanks very much.